Hello everyone. Psychic Terrain teams are terrible. This is a statement that's obvious to singles players and blasphemous to doubles players. Psychic Terrain was first introduced in Sun and Moon with Tapu Lele, which was instantly an incredibly powerful Pokemon in both singles and doubles. It had the offensively potent Fairy and Psychic combo, an amazing 130 base special attack, and, most importantly of all, the ability Psychic Surge, setting terrain upon switching in. Psychic Terrain granted a 1.5 times boost to Psychic-type attacks and made all grounded Pokemon immune to priority. Both of these effects are incredibly powerful. It wouldn't be controversial to say that Psychic Terrain is the most powerful terrain, and by a large margin. Despite Tapu Lele's dominance, Psychic Terrain-based teams essentially didn't exist in Sun and Moon Overused, the main format for competitive singles. While Tapu Lele was amazing, so were the other Tapus. If your team relied too heavily on Psychic Terrain, you were setting yourself up for failure. Your opponent would likely have at least one Tapu, making it easy to overwrite your terrain. The closest a team got to being truly Psychic Terrain-based was running Mega Alakazam and Tapu Lele together. Being a Psychic-type attacker, Alakazam loved the boost to its stab moves, and being extremely fast and frail naturally made it very weak to priority, so it loved being immune to that as well. Although this was a nice core, it wasn't a true Psychic Terrain team, not in the way you have Rain teams or Trick Room teams. In VGC and other doubles formats, Tapu Lele was occasionally seen with other Psychic types, or something holding a Psychic Seed, but often not even a single Pokemon on the team would directly take advantage of Psychic Terrain. The next generation, Sword and Shield, brought major changes to Psychic Terrain. There was a significant nerf, now only boosting Psychic moves by 1.3 times, but there was also a buff, the move Expanding Force. It's an 80 base power Psychic-type special attack, already not weak, but under Psychic Terrain it gets a 1.5 times boost to 120 base power, and that's not considering the 1.3 times terrain boost, so you ultimately have a 156 base power Psychic move. And, to make it even better, it's a spread move. So in doubles formats, this is a 117 base power move hitting both opposing Pokemon. Tapu Lele didn't learn Expanding Force, but it was still a strong Pokemon, usually working solo, much like in the past. Indeedee and Hatterene both did get Expanding Force though, and they worked incredibly well together. Psychic Terrain teams were better than ever in doubles formats. But in singles, things went completely the other way. Tapu Lele was still incredible in Sword and Shield Overuse, but the addition of Expanding Force didn't help at all. In fact, Psychic Terrain-based teams were even worse than before. The 1.5 times to 1.3 times nerf for Psychic moves obviously hurt, and the spread move benefit of Expanding Force was irrelevant. The problem of conflicting terrain setters also got worse. On top of worrying about the Tapus, more Pokemon with terrain setting abilities were added to the game, and one of them was Rillaboom. Rillaboom was, and is to this day, the worst news ever for Psychic Terrain teams. Not only did it overwrite Psychic Terrain with Grassy Terrain, but it also had Grassy Glide, a 70 base power priority move, or 91 base power after terrain. In one fell swoop, Rillaboom removed terrain and could now hit your probably frail Expanding Force users with a priority move, and blocking priority was probably a big part of why you set Psychic Terrain in the first place. To make matters even worse, Grassy Glide isn't technically a priority move. It only has priority when grassy terrain is on the field. If you switch in Tapu Lele on Bullet Punch, Aqua Jet, or any other priority move, you'll be immune and take no damage, but when Psychic Terrain is set, Grassy Glide is no longer a priority move, so you'll have to eat the hit, and with every Psychic Surge Pokemon being extremely physically frail, this is really bad news. And Rillaboom was a very popular Pokemon, at times on around a quarter of teams. Tapu Lele itself was still great, but the concept of actually having a team based around Psychic Terrain was further away than ever. Sword and Shield Overused didn't even have a common two Pokemon core like Lele and Mega Alakazam. Tapu Lele just stood on its own. Then came Scarlet and Violet, which changed everything. Tapu Lele and every other Tapu were no longer in the game. For doubles formats, this wasn't a huge deal. Indeedee was still around, and while it wasn't nearly as strong as Tapu Lele, Expanding Force was still an insane move, and Psychic Terrain teams, while not as dominant as before, remained a serious force in the metagame. In singles, though, the Tapus being removed was the best possible outcome for the dream of a Psychic Terrain team. Losing Tapu Lele wasn't ideal, but all Tapus being gone meant that there weren't nearly as many Pokemon to overwrite terrain. Exchanging Tapu Lele for Indeedee is a great deal if it means you can actually keep terrain on the field for more than a few turns. Not many Pokemon with terrain setting abilities remained, and most were competitively irrelevant. Miraidon was instantly banned to the Ubers tier, so it wasn't a concern for the main format. Pincurchin is absolutely terrible and gets close to zero usage, so it's not a problem either. Galarian Weezing would become a force in the overused metagame, but that's thanks to neutralizing gas. It almost never uses Misty Surge. Unfortunately, though, the one terrain setter Psychic terrain teams most wanted to be gone remained. Rillaboom was still there. Now, Grassy Glide was nerfed to 55 base power, and although Terra Grass was now an option to make Grassy Glide stronger than ever, it was still a good nerf. This nerf, combined with the natural progression of power creep, made Rillaboom much less frequently used in Scarlet and Violet, now at only around 7% usage. Still a strong Pokemon, but not the metagame-defining force it was in Sword and Shield. And, as I said, Rillaboom was the only real Pokemon setting terrain. So now, if you used an Indeedee with a terrain extender 93% of the time, there would be nothing to contest your 8 turns of terrain. You could actually keep Psychic terrain on the field very easily. Moves like Defog and the newly added Ice Spinner did remove terrain, but this wasn't a big deal. Your opponent having to use an attack to get rid of terrain is much easier to manage than it being overwritten just by switching in a Pokemon. I was super excited to give Psychic terrain teams a try. I felt like for the first time, this imaginary archetype might just be real. But I ended up disappointed. Psychic terrain teams certainly were better than ever, but not good enough to be consistent or respected at a top level. The archetype as a whole ended up largely being a gimmicky matchup fish. Every Psychic terrain team looked almost exactly the same. You'd have Indeedee, Hatterene, Armarouge, Polteageist, and 2 more supporting Pokemon or terrain abusers chosen from a rather small pool of options. These teams also played almost the exact same way every game, and whether you won or lost often depended on whether or not your opponent had an answer to Polteageist. Polteageist quickly emerged as the best Psychic terrain abuser. This may seem odd at first, with it not being a Psychic type and not learning Expanding Force, but it had the perfect set of tools to destroy most teams if Psychic terrain was up. Polteageist would run Focus Sash, Shell Smash sets. The Sash allowed it to take at least 1 hit and boost its speed, attack, and special attack by 2 stages, and it worked well with its ability Weak Armor, lowering defense but boosting speed by 2 stages if hit by a physical attack. This all worked extremely well with Stored Power. After a Shell Smash and a Weak Armor boost, Stored Power was 180 base power, 234 after the 1.3 times Psychic terrain boost. This is so strong that it has a chance to one-hit KO Dragonite through multiscale. It also ran Shadow Ball, of course, for a stab, and the last essential move, Terra Blast. Ghost and Psychic attacks are both walled by Dark types, but with Terra Blast Fighting or Fairy, Polteageist could easily destroy those as well. Psychic terrain teams would run Indeedee to set terrain and Magic Bounce Hatterene to block any entry hazards to preserve Polteageist's Focus Sash. At some point in the game, you could bring Polteageist in on a physical attacker, and the trap was set. If you attack Polteageist, you give it a Weak Armor boost, making it impossibly fast and making Stored Power even stronger. If you switch out or chose not to attack, well, now its Focus Sash is still intact and it can use Shell Smash again. That's even worse. This Polteageist trap made Psychic terrain teams almost unanimously hated, both on ladder and in tournaments. A lot of otherwise solid teams just straight up lost to Polteageist. But a lot of teams also didn't lose to it. There was counterplay. A lot of counterplay. Multi-hit moves would destroy Polteageist in one shot, making its Weak Armor a liability. Iron Valiant with booster energy speed could enter on a Shell Smash, outspeed, and use Encore. Moves like Ice Spinner would remove terrain, allowing you to finish Polteageist off with a priority move. Phasing moves like Whirlwind and Roar were also good, allowing you to put off the Polteageist issue until later, ideally when you're in a better position or there are fewer turns of Psychic terrain remaining. Hisuian Samurott was another huge issue for Polteageist and Psychic terrain as a whole. Magic Bounce doesn't block the spikes set by Ceaseless Edge, so those hazards would break Polteageist's Focus Sash and ruin the strategy. And of course, there was Rillaboom. If you had a Rillaboom on your team, you had nothing to worry about. You would easily beat any Psychic terrain team and KO Polteageist with no issues. And if all else failed, you could deal with Polteageist by Terra guessing games. Your Kingambit could survive a Terra Blast Fighting if you use something like Terra Fire. Now, if Polteageist predicts this and uses stored power, you're dead, but it at least gives you a 50-50 shot. Now, you're probably thinking, wow, Pink Across, that's kind of a lot of counters for Polteageist, and yeah, it is. As I said, Psychic Terrain teams were not consistent or good. About half of all teams had a pretty easy and reliable response to Polteageist, and the other half either straight up lost or had to rely on Terra mind games. This is what made Psychic Terrain teams truly unpleasant in every way. If you're using Psychic Terrain, half the time you'll face a team that will be a real uphill battle to beat. If you're facing Psychic Terrain, half the time you'll get destroyed by a teapot, or the game will come down to a Terra 50-50. It sucked to use and sucked to play against. Games involving Psychic Terrain were almost always unfulfilling matchup fishes. Psychic Terrain continued to be a gimmicky matchup fishing archetype for years, irritating players on the ladder and even tournaments in some cases. It was never good enough to be taken seriously, but it was good enough to screw you over in a bad matchup. Then, on April 26, 2026, Terra Blast was banned. Polteageist heavily relied on Terra Blast for coverage. Without it, any team with a dark type could easily stop a Polteageist sweep. Its reign of terror was over, and the strongest soldier of Psychic Terrain had fallen. I figured this was the death of Psychic Terrain. It was already an inconsistent and weak archetype, and this massive nerf to Polteageist felt like the death blow. Part of me was sad that this unique archetype was lost, but after having so many irritating games against Psychic Terrain teams, mostly I was just relieved. Oddly though, a part of me was more inclined to build Psychic Terrain than before. I'd hated the Terra guessing games that Polteageist forced, and Terra Blast no longer being an option made the idea of building Psychic Terrain more appealing. I wouldn't be forced into playing those guessing games. Still, I didn't have the hubris to think I could build a Psychic Terrain team successfully. This was an archetype that had been a joke for years. Nobody had ever had significant success with it, and it just got nerfed. I thought there was simply no way. Until a month later, when a viewer, Leonardo Barbosa Teles, had an idea. He thought Galarian Slowbro might work well on Psychic Terrain. In competitive singles, Pokemon are sorted into tiers based on usage, with overused at the top, then underused, rarely used, never used PU, and zero used. Galarian Slowbro is in PU. It's not considered a strong Pokemon in the main format, but the concept of using it on Psychic Terrain intrigued me. Galarian Slowbro has a very unique ability, Quick Draw, which gives it a 30% chance to move first, like a Quick Claw effect. And if you also give it a Quick Claw, which has a 20% chance to help you move first, you end up with a 44% chance to move first. You might think this would fail in Psychic Terrain, since it blocks priority moves, but Quick Claw and Quick Draw aren't true priority moves, they just allow Slowbro to move first in its priority bracket. So you can activate Quick Claw and attack just fine in Psychic Terrain, while still blocking priority moves like Kingambit's Sucker Punch that would otherwise give Slowbro problems. Galarian Slowbro also gets Nasty Plot and Expanding Force, making it an incredible offensive threat. Perhaps most importantly of all though, it resists Grass. It resists Rillaboom's Grassy Glide. Ironically, despite the inherent inconsistency of Quick Draw and Quick Claw, I thought Galarian Slowbro might just be the key to making Psychic Terrain teams more consistent by improving the Rillaboom matchup. It seemed like a bit of a stretch, but this idea awakened that latent desire I'd had to build Psychic Terrain ever since the ban of Terra Blast. So, on May 30th, I live-streamed my first attempt at building and laddering Psychic Terrain with Galarian Slowbro. I EV invested Slowbro in HP and special attack with a modest nature, and gave it a Quick Claw, of course. I gave it Nasty Plot and Expanding Force, and settled on Surf and Flamethrower for coverage, mostly to hit dark types like Tinglu and Kingambit respectively. And I went with Terra Water, to boost the power of Surf and avoid all of those super effective hits that Slowbro struggles with. Next, I knew I would need an Indeedee. The typical set I'd used in the past is Speedy Max HP, Expanding Force, Healing Wish, Encore, and Dazzling Gleam, of course holding a Terrain Extender. But I wanted to try something different. I went with a bulkier physically defensive set, with Trick Room over Dazzling Gleam. This set had been successful on a few Trick Room teams, and I wanted to give this team a semi-Trick Room component, so it didn't need to rely on Galarian Slowbro getting Quick Claw or Quick Draw to be fast. I knew there would still be times where I would need to count on it, but consistency never hurts, and Trick Room can help in a lot of unexpected situations. Some suggested running a female Indeedee for the superior defenses, but the female doesn't learn Expanding Force. Even with no special attack investment, Expanding Force can really pack a punch, and I didn't want this team to be too passive. With the two obvious Pokemon down, I went and added the next most obvious Pokemon, Armarouge and Hatterene. After Polteageist's fall from grace, Armarouge was probably the strongest Psychic Terrain abuser. Armarouge almost always use a weak armor weakness policy set with Expanding Force, Armor Cannon, and Endure, with some filler move in the last slot. I chose Aura Sphere. I was tempted to use a Modest Nature, but Timid was necessary to speed tie Iron Valiant with a booster energy at +2, a very nice speed tier to hit. And for Terra, I chose Psychic to make Expanding Force even stronger. The combination of weak armor and weakness policy is truly insane. If you switch in Armarouge on, say, a Zamazenta using Crunch, you have the bulk to easily tank a hit, and now you have +2 speed and +2 special attack. There's probably nothing that can outspeed you, and potentially nothing that can take even a single hit. And since Psychic Terrain is up, priority won't save your opponent. And if there isn't a weak, super effective move to switch in on, that's where Endure comes in. You can use Endure against a Great Tusk Headlong Rush, survive the hit on 1 HP, and now you have your +2 speed and +2 special attack. Even if your opponent carefully plays around weakness policy, Armarouge is still a threat. With base 125 special attack, a 120 base power fire move with Armor Cannon, and the 156 base power Expanding Force, this Pokemon is almost always high value. I knew any successful Psychic Terrain team would have an Armarouge. As for Hatterene, it's been a Psychic Terrain staple since the start of the generation. It was especially important for preserving Polteageist's Focus Sash, but other Psychic Terrain abusers like Armarouge also hate entry hazards. Hatterene also uses Expanding Force well, making it a no-brainer choice here. I went with a defensive eject button set, so I could use Hatterene to gain some early game momentum. Usually the plan was to lead with Indeedee, then switch into eject button Hatterene to bring in a more threatening abuser like Armarouge. For the moves, Expanding Force, Draining Kiss, Trick Room, and Healing Wish. I figured a defensive supporting Hatterene would serve the team best, and it's a set that's worked well for me in the past. It was also nice to have another Trick Room setter for Galarian Slowbro. Now the obvious Pokemon were added. The last two slots were more difficult. I figured I could fit in one more abuser and one more support Pokemon. I looked for the support Pokemon first and settled on Iron Treads. It gave my team entry hazards with Stealth Rock and additional removal, so I wasn't fully reliant on Hatterene's Magic Bounce. It also gave my team an immunity to Electric and a resist to Normal, Bug, Rock, and Flying. I went with a typical max speed, max attack set, Stealth Rock, Rapid Spin, Earthquake, and Knockoff. I gave it an Air Balloon since my team currently had no ground resist and 3 ground weak Pokemon. This wasn't a full solution, but it helped a little bit. And I went with Terra Ghost, so Iron Treads could become a Rapid Spin blocker if Stealth Rock looked really great against my opponent. For the last slot, I was torn between Hawlucha and Polteageist. Hawlucha gave the team a true ground immunity and a dark resist, and some real speed control, but I was tempted to see if Polteageist was still good. Maybe the loss of Terra Blast wasn't as bad as I thought. While I expected to replace it for Hawlucha later, I started with Polteageist in my 6th slot, very similar to the set I described before, but with Giga Drain where Terra Blast used to be, and Terra Grass to boost its power. Now that I had my 6 Pokemon, I went and selected my Terra types for Hatterene and Indeedee. For Hatterene, I went with Dark, as the team had major problems with Ghost and Dark types. For Indeedee, I settled on Fairy to gain a resistance to Dark and U-Turn. Leaving defensive Terra types until all 6 Pokemon are on the team is generally the right approach. It's hard to tell what emergency defensive options you might need until you know what your team is weak to. Now the full team was assembled and I was ready to go. The first game was against a Hyper Offense team. Armarouge at first seemed like it was about to run away with the entire game after using Endure on a Cerulege's Poltergeist, but then the Cerulege turned out to be Focus Sash. Polteageist then entered, but it was easily stopped by Kingambit since it had no Terra Blast. Not a good game 1 showing for Polteageist, reinforcing my beliefs that Hawlucha was probably better. Slowbro had a fantastic showing though, eating a Kowtow Cleave from Kingambit and ultimately winning the game by sweeping under Trick Room set by Indeedee. The next game was against a Sticky Web team. For a second there, it looked like Polteageist was about to prove itself in sweep, but then it got taken out by a Mirror Herb Zamazenta. Slowbro, though, had a great showing again. A Quick Draw and Quick Claw activation gave Slowbro 2 KOs in a row on Raging Bolt and Glamora, and it finished off Gliscor with Terra Water Surf. Game 3 was another win, and Slowbro performed incredibly well, KOing the opponent's Heatran and weakening Kyurem. Surprisingly, it was Polteageist that really put in the most work, though. I still thought Hawlucha would have been better, but it did have a good game here since the opponent had no dark type. Game 4, though, was the real test. Game 4 was against Rillaboom. And not just Rillaboom, but also Tyranitar, an incredibly specially bulky dark type. Definitely not a combo a Psychic Terrain team wants to see. It was a difficult game, but the ultimate savior was Slowbro. It got a crucial quick draw activation to KO a Great Tusk, and ended the game by surviving a Grassy Glide and KOing Rillaboom with Flamethrower. I had just defeated a competent high elo player using Rillaboom with a Psychic Terrain team. And I hadn't even added on Hawlucha yet. This was going so much better than I thought it would. Things didn't go so well in Game 5. I let my opponent set up Stealth Rock, and I couldn't remove hazards against their Petrarunt, so I slowly lost. And Polteageist was once again terrible, while a Hawlucha would have been amazing. That was the last straw. Polteageist was out, Hawlucha was in. I went with a Psychic Seed Unburdened set, of course, Acrobatics in close combat as stabs, Swords Dance to boost attack, and Encore to lock Pokemon into non-attacking moves, and Locking Gambit and Raging Bolt into Sucker Punch and Thunderclap. Despite not being grounded, and thus not benefiting from Psychic Terrain's priority immunity, Hawlucha is one of the best terrain abusers out there, and has been since Generation 7. When it consumes its Psychic Seed, it gets double speed from its ability Unburden, and its Acrobatics also doubles in power from 55 to 110 since it's no longer holding an item. This gave my team a ground immunity and a dark resist, as well as speed that wasn't reliant on a setup move. I gave it an Adamant Nature and max attack, enough speed to outpace Choice Scarf Darkrai after Unburden, and the rest in HP. Terra Electric was chosen to turn Zapdos into setup fodder and make Hawlucha immune to Paralysis. It also grounds Hawlucha, allowing it to gain immunity to priority if needed. It might seem odd that I added Hawlucha so late and tolerated Polteageist's poor performance for so long, but this is a strategy I use in team building. When you're split between several options, go with the one you either don't use as often or the one you think is less likely to work. This allows you to give it a fair try, and sometimes you'll be surprised. If you start with whatever you're used to or whatever you think will work best, you're probably not going to try anything else later. This strategy does often lead to disappointing results like this Polteageist, but not always. I expected Defensive Indeedee would be bad, and that I would really miss the speed investment, but it turned out to be great. With the team adjusted, I got back on the ladder. The rest of the stream was a bit rocky, mostly due to playing errors on my part, but Hawlucha certainly performed well, and Galarian Slowbro continued to be the MVP. I ended with a 6-3 record, and that was all in high ladder. I knew this was a project I would continue working on off-stream. It looked like Psychic Terrain might just be viable. And when I say viable, I don't mean it can get some wins here and there. I mean it has a real place at a top level. If you look at something like snow teams, they can get wins here and there, and if you got a good matchup in a high-level tournament, you might even win there too, but you're shooting yourself in the foot by using it. No top player who's doing their absolute best to win pulls up with a snow team, and no top player doing their best to win is using a full Psychic Terrain team. At least, not yet. For the first time in years, I thought I might just be able to make a team that changed that. Still, I knew I wasn't there yet. This team had flaws. The major issue I was having was with speed. The fastest Pokemon on my team other than Unburdened Hawlucha was Iron Treads, which, while not slow at 343, it still gets outsped by a lot. My opponents kept leading with faster breakers like Ogerpon Wellspring, Choice Specs Iron Valiant, or Darkrai. Darkrai in particular was a big problem. I put Terra Fighting on my Armrouge to try and improve the Darkrai situation, which helped a little, but it wasn't a real solution. Hawlucha, of course, could outspeed Darkrai, Ogerpon, and everything else after Unburden, but I can't just bring that out all the time. Unburden only activates once, and Hawlucha works best as a late-game sweeper. It rarely wants to come out mid or early game. I needed an actual, naturally fast Pokemon. I found a creative solution, one that a few viewers recommended during the original stream: Cinderace instead of Iron Treads. Like Iron Treads, it helped with hazard control, just Court Change instead of Rapid Spin. Although this isn't true removal, it's particularly effective on this team. The risk of Court Change is that your opponent may be able to reset hazards, and like all Psychic Terrain teams, this team completely falls apart if the opponent gets hazards up. but Magic Bounce Hatterene provides a major roadblock to your opponent trying to reset hazards. And even more importantly, this is a hyper-offense team, the most offensive and fast-paced archetype there is. It applies a ton of constant offensive pressure and typically generates very short games, so it's not too difficult to play in such a way that your opponent doesn't have a chance to reset hazards. Removing Iron Treads did also remove the team's ability to set Stealth Rock, but I didn't consider this a major problem. Stealth Rock had rarely been crucial for victories, and the team cared much more about preventing hazards on my side than setting them up on the opponent's side. Some may also note the concern that Iron Treads was our only electric immunity. Typically, every team needs an electric immunity, because otherwise, electric types can spam Volt Switch against you. In singles, pivoting moves are incredibly powerful, and Volt Switch is by far the best of them all if you don't have a ground type. Suppose you're using a balanced team and a Choice Spec Zapdos enters on your Corviknight. If you don't have a ground type, you have two terrible choices. Either let your Corviknight die, or switch into something on your team, eat the Volt Switch damage, and let your opponent get the upper hand by choosing whatever on their team is best against what you brought out. And you have to deal with this every single time Zapdos hits the field. That's why you need a ground type. It gives you a third option. Switch into that ground type and block the Volt Switch. The only archetype exempt from this electric immunity requirement has historically been hyper offense teams. You won't get stuck in the same trap that a bulkier team would. Partly because hyper offense teams apply constant offensive pressure. It won't be easy for a breaker like Zapdos to enter the field. But even if a Zapdos does manage to enter and threaten a Volt Switch, it's not a problem. A balanced team can't afford to just sack their Corviknight to Volt Switch, but I absolutely can leave in my Armarouge to deal a ton of damage and then be KO'd by a pivoting move or any other move. That's what sets Hyper Offense apart from other archetypes. Hyper Offense teams are designed to function well when Pokemon are KO'd. They don't have codependent defensive cores. Letting Pokemon be KO'd is part of the game plan. So even though it looks like Volt Switch is a super free move to click against my team, it's actually quite manageable. And on top of that, the eject button actually blocks the pivoting effect of pivot attacking moves. So if Hatterene switches in on Volt Switch or U-turn with its eject button intact, Hatterene will switch out, but the Volt Switch user won't. The other reason I'd want an electric immunity, and the reason most overused hyper offense teams still want one despite being alright against Volt Switch, is Raging Bolt's insanely powerful priority move, Thunderclap. But, of course, that isn't a concern to me since Psychic Terrain blocks priority moves. All of this to say, I expected that my team was one of the few exceptions to the electric immunity rule. Replacing Iron Treads for Cinderace introduced other issues, though, or at least things that might seem like issues. The team now didn't have a resistance to normal, flying, or rock, and even when Iron Treads was on the team, we never had a resistance to water. For most archetypes, this is completely unacceptable, but when a team is hyper offense, a lot of liberties can be taken on the defensive side. As I said, hyper offense teams are designed to let Pokemon die, so having to sack something to a water or flying attack isn't the end of the world. Still, these weaknesses were something to keep an eye on as I continued developing the team. The Cinderace set I chose was a bit unusual. The main reason I wanted a Cinderace in the first place was to outpace threats that Iron Treads couldn't, while still offering hazard support. And while Cinderace does outspeed Ogerpon, Wellspring, and Iron Valiant, I knew threats like Darkrai and Meowscarada would still be a nightmare to deal with. So I went with a Choice Scarf Libero Cinderace. I invested enough EVs in speed to hit 301 so I could outspeed Great Tusk after a rapid spin. Then I went Adamant Max Attack for power and the rest in HP to make it surprisingly bulky. For the moves, Court Change, Pyro Ball, U-turn, and High Jump Kick. Terra Fire for the stronger Pyro Balls. Cinderace almost always wants to run heavy-duty boots, being a hazard control Pokemon that's extremely weak to hazards itself, but I figured with support from Hatterene, it might be able to function without them. When I tried it out, Cinderace immediately worked much better than I had expected. Having such a fast Pokemon instantly transformed how the team played. I was no longer forced to bring out Hawlucha early in the game. Leads that used to be devastating, like Ogerpon, Wellspring, and Darkrai, were now easy to deal with. I could just start with Cinderace. Almost every Pokemon that takes advantage of an Indeedee lead absolutely hates facing Cinderace. I would often lead Cinderace against a breaker like Ogerpon, Wellspring, or Darkrai, U-turn as that breaker was scared out, and then bring in Indeedee. Cinderace also helped the team flow much better, providing a pivoting move. Previously, eject button Hatterene was my only way of pivoting, unless you count Healing Wish. Although hyper-offense teams don't switch around a lot, they still do need to switch around sometimes, especially when there's a need to reset Psychic Terrain a few times throughout the game. Hard switching all the time with such frail Pokemon had felt very clunky. And I really wasn't missing Stealth Rock either. There were some games where it would be nice, but generally the team functioned fine without them, and I could often just steal entry hazards from my opponent with Court Change. The fact that Court Change couldn't be blocked, unlike Iron Tread's Rapid Spin, also made hazard removal much more reliable. My concerns about not having heavy-duty boots were also put to rest. Cinderace did occasionally have to eat Stealth Rock or Spikes damage, but it was well worth the incredible speed the Choice Scarf provided. Cinderace was also a potent offensive threat in its own right. You'd be surprised how many teams can be swept by a Terrafire Pyro Ball from a Choice Scarf Cinderace in the endgame. It also gave me another Grass Resist. My team now had 4 Pokemon that resist Grassy Glide. Rillaboom is the ultimate enemy of Psychic Terrain, so much so that even with 4 Grass Resist, it was still the #1 threat to my team, but it was more manageable now than ever. Cinderace was performing so well, particularly in the area of hazard control, I began to wonder if I even needed Hatterene to keep entry hazards off my side of the field. In a burst of creativity, while I was drunk on the success of my unorthodox Cinderace set, I tried replacing Hatterene and Armrouge for a Lepaberry Revival Blessing Pawmot and a Nasty Plot Life Orb Deoxys Speed. The idea was that Pawmot's Revival Blessing could allow me to play a lot more recklessly, even let Indeedee be KO'd or KO itself with Healing Wish, and just revive it to set Psychic Terrain again. And despite how strong Armrouge was, the fact that it depended on the one-time use weakness policy made it seem like a poor recipient for Revival Blessing, so I went with Deoxys Speed instead. It's not that the Hatterene Armrouge version was performing poorly, I just wanted to see if this new idea had any merit. And it did not. Replacing Hatterene was a huge mistake. This team was getting destroyed by hazards. Even when I tried switching Cinderace to a heavy-duty boot set, hazards were too much of a problem. Pawmot was pretty terrible as well, and I really missed having Armrouge. It felt like a much stronger sweeper than Deoxys. So I scrapped that branch and went back to the Hatterene, Armrouge, Choice Scarf, Cinderace version. The team was working well, miles better than the original Iron Tread's Polteageist team. But it wasn't yet great. It was still inconsistent, and unfortunately, I knew the source of that inconsistency. With a heavy heart, I admitted that the weak link was Galarian Slowbro. The first stream, it was the MVP, but I also only played 9 games, a relatively small sample size. It scored some crucial quick draws and quick claws that stream, but as I played more and more games, that 44% chance was often letting me down. That first stream, the team also just had bigger issues. Polteageist was terrible, and even after that was replaced with Hawlucha, Iron Treads being the fastest Pokemon was the next major problem. But now that those errors were corrected, the next biggest problem became a lot more noticeable. Even with Indeedee and Hatterene setting Trick Room, Slowbro just didn't have the consistency to be on a top-level team. At least, not this team. I tried replacing it for a more reliable Expanding Force user, Deoxys Speed. I went with a Life Orb set, modest max special attack EV investment, enough speed to hit 451, outspeeding Great Tusk after a Rapid Spin, and the rest in HP. These 32 HP EVs also hit 249 HP, optimizing the 10% damage from Life Orb being rounded down. For the moves, Expanding Force of course, Nasty Plot, and Ice Beam and Focus Blast for coverage. I hate running Focus Blast, but it's the best special attack Deoxys has to hit Kingambit, one of the most used Pokemon in the tier. And lastly, I went with Terra Psychic for more power. As I queued up my first game with Deoxys, I was almost hoping it wouldn't work well. I really wanted Galarian Slowbro to be good, to be the best option. But unfortunately, and fortunately, Deoxys was fantastic. It got 3 KOs in its first game, and afterwards continued to be a consistent and amazing performer. I had to admit, Slowbro was out, and Deoxys was in. This was the change that really made the team take off. This entire process of testing and adjusting the team, I was still in high ladder, around top 100, but with Deoxys, I truly started to climb. It was during this climb that I realized I hadn't once considered my stall matchup. I had been so focused on Rillaboom and other offensive threats that I hadn't spared a thought for how I would fare against the most bulky archetype. Fortunately, it turned out my worries were unfounded. Expanding Force Armarouge and Deoxys put immense pressure on stall teams. If Blissey used Terra Dark or Steel and got lucky with dodging Focus Blast, it was possible to withstand the first round of attacks by Deoxys speed, but with 2 Healing Wish Pokemon in the back to restore Deoxys and let it try again, they never had a chance. Every stall team I faced during my run got absolutely destroyed. None of the games were even close. As I continued laddering, Deoxys brought me into the top 30, then to the top 10. It seemed like I might have done it, made a consistent and solid Psychic Terrain team. Then I ran into a Rillaboom, and I lost, badly. I realized that when I had removed Galarian Slowbro, I had made the team better in 93% of games, but that 7% when I faced Rillaboom, that matchup had gotten a lot worse. Despite having 3 grass resists, the Rillaboom matchup was very difficult. This might seem crazy, but consider it. Hawlucha isn't really much of a grass resist, at least when it comes to switching into Rillaboom. If it switches in when grassy terrain is up, it won't get the Psychic Seed and will therefore be extremely easy to switch into with its 55 base power acrobatics. On top of that, Choice Band Terra Grass Grassy Glide is likely to 2-hit KO Hawlucha, even with all my HP investment. Armarouge could normally take 2 Grassy Glides, but thanks to Weak Armor, it also gets 2-hit KO'd. Cinderace, as you could probably guess at this point, also gets 2-hit KO'd. Galarian Slowbro was likely to survive even 3 Terra Grass Banded Glides, but it was no longer on the team. And Deoxys dies in 1 hit. I thought maybe with proper playing I could navigate the threat of Rillaboom, but then I lost to it again. And then I lost again. Part of me thought that maybe I just needed to accept the bad matchup. After all, I'd made a Psychic Terrain team that was mostly performing well near the top of the ladder, and if I didn't run into any Rillaboom teams, I thought I had a good chance of achieving rank 1. But I just couldn't stomach this bad matchup. Having a near instant loss whenever I saw Rillaboom just wasn't acceptable. If my team couldn't take on Rillaboom, I knew I'd rather shut the project down and move on to other ideas. The simplest solution was putting a grass-resistant Terra, like Terra Grass, on Deoxys Speed, but this bothered me. Terra Psychic was a big part of Deoxys Speed's impressive power. By giving it Terra Grass, I worried that I was watering down my team and making it worse in 93% of games, just to help with this 7% of the time I saw Rillaboom. Especially with Armarouge being Terra fighting already, I was hesitant to make this change. It seemed like a bad idea to be using a Psychic Terrain team and not have a single Pokemon with Terra Psychic Expanding Force. Then I realized I didn't need Terra fighting on Armarouge at all. I had it on there to help with Darkrai, which was no longer really a problem. Not only did Cinderace switch in and 1-hit KO with U-turn, now I even had Deoxys to outspeed it. So I put Terra Psychic back on Armarouge and went with Terra Grass on Deoxys. The rationale for Terra Grass over some other grass-resistant Terra type was that it also helped with water, which the team has no resistance to. I considered Dragon as well, but the ground resistance offered by Grass occasionally came in handy against Earthquake, particularly from Ting Lu, which was a very common switch into Deoxys. It felt great having Terra Psychic back on Armarouge. It turned out to be a Terra I used quite frequently, and on Deoxys, I didn't miss Terra Psychic as much as I thought I would. Most importantly, I could now take on Rillaboom. It couldn't just bully my Deoxys off the field with the threat of a 1-hit KO. The next Rillaboom team I faced got absolutely destroyed. There was one last change to make though, the Trick Room aspect of the team. After all, Hatterene and Indeedee mostly had Trick Room to add consistency to Galarian Slowbro, which had been removed. Now I had a Choice Scarf Cinderace, a Deoxys Speed, a Weak Armor Armarouge, and an Unburdened Hawlucha, paired with 2 Trick Room setters. 4 extremely fast Pokemon and 2 Trick Room setters seems like a 1000 ELO strategy, and if I'd been thinking more carefully, I probably would have removed Trick Room from both of these Pokemon when I swapped Slowbro for Deoxys. But honestly, I just forgot. And then, to my surprise, as I continued to ladder, I found Trick Room extremely helpful. Not only did it allow Indeedee and Hatterene to take advantage of it on their own, but Armarouge often took advantage of Trick Room very well. Before Weak Armor activates, Armarouge is slower than almost everything on offensive teams, so it could outspeed everything in Trick Room during the early game, then activate Weak Armor later and outspeed everything again outside of Trick Room. And sometimes the opponent would just have really fast Pokemon, maybe a booster speed Iron Treads that used Rapid Spin. a Booster Speed Iron Valiant, or a Choice Scarf Darkrai. Against these Pokemon, almost everything on my team could take advantage of Trick Room. There were even times where Deoxys Speed moved first, thanks to Trick Room. This seemingly out-of-place strategy turned out to be the secret sauce of this team, saving matchups that would otherwise be nearly unwinnable. In this game against the then rank 2 player, I instantly knew I was in trouble. Walking Wake is a really rough matchup for my team. With a Photosynthesis speed boost, Choice Specs Terra Water Hydro's team can basically run through my entire team. Only Hawlucha outspeeds it, and its close combat only deals about 60%. But Indeedee using Trick Room turn 1 made the matchup winnable. I brought in Armrouge under Trick Room, ensuring Walking Wake couldn't safely enter. Eventually, Walking Wake came in when Trick Room ran out, but by then my Armrouge had taken a hit and activated Weakness Policy, and I was able to KO the Walking Wake. I changed Indeedee to Terra Water after this game. The turn 1 Trick Room saved me this time, but having a Terra to survive Hydro's team helped make the Sun matchup more consistent, and I wasn't using Terra Fairy hardly ever. This early game Trick Room ultimately allowed me to win after a tight endgame, bringing me to just 1 win away from rank 1. I needed just 1 more win to achieve what, to my knowledge, no full Psychic Terrain team had ever achieved. A consistent ladder performance, an uninterrupted run of dozens of games, never once switching away from Psychic Terrain, that ended in a rank 1 peak. I was shaking as I queued up the game, and then when I saw what I was facing, I breathed a sigh of relief. It was a Sticky Web team. In my entire run to this point, I hadn't lost a single game against Sticky Web. It's a really horrible matchup for them. For starters, I have Hatterene to make it hard to set Sticky Web and Cinderace to court change even if they manage to. And when Sticky Web teams can't slow you down, the last thing they want to see is a Deoxys Speed and Psychic Terrain. They tend to hate Hawlucha as well. So I was confident going into it. I led with Indeedee as I usually do, and my opponent made a smart play by not starting with Araquanid, but rather Raging Bolt. I went for Expanding Force for some solid damage, then switched into Hatterene and ejected into Armrouge, finishing Bolt off with Expanding Force. Araquanid entered, and I endured, getting a Weakness Policy boost before KOing Araquanid. The game was going well. Iron Valiant entered, and I figured it didn't hurt to preserve Armrouge, so I went into Cinderace. Iron Moth then switched in and took over half from Pyro Ball, the Adamant nature coming in handy. Then disaster struck, a Pyro Ball miss. Cinderace went down, and I reset terrain before sacking Hatterene to the Iron Moth. Things were now a bit scary. I went for Expanding Force to KO Iron Moth, but my opponent brought in Kingambit. Now I had to hope my Focus Blast hit, and it didn't. Fortunately, this Kingambit appeared not to have Kowtow Cleave. I made a prediction. I clicked Nasty Plot, and it paid off, allowing me to KO Gholdengo next turn. My opponent brought in Iron Moth and successfully baited me into wasting a Psychic Terrain turn as they switched back into Kingambit. Once again, I really needed to count on Focus Blast. And I missed again. Now I was really nervous. I didn't want to come this far just to lose to a Pyro Ball miss and 2 Focus Blast misses. I needed to play aggressively. I went into Armrouge and clicked Expanding Force on the Kingambit, and I got the read right. Iron Moth switched in and went down. Iron Valiant then entered, and I let Indeedee go. I brought in my Hawlucha, used Terra Electric, and went for Acrobatics, hoping to KO the Iron Valiant, but it dodged the KO with Terra Ghost. This was a very scary spot. It seems like I'm in the clear. Just click Acrobatics, then Close Combat. But if my opponent managed to switch around between Iron Valiant to be immune to Close Combat and Kingambit to tank Acrobatics for enough turns to stall out Psychic Terrain, I could lose to Sucker Punch. To avoid this switching cycle, I went for Swords Dance, and fortunately, I didn't get critical hit. My opponent, oddly, just let Iron Valiant go down. This entire game, they had made aggressive predictions turn after turn, but in the endgame, they didn't make any such attempts. Terra Electric had grounded my Hawlucha, so I was immune to Sucker Punch and clicked Close Combat to end the game. I had done it. On June 8th, I hit rank 1 after over a week of using nothing but Psychic Terrain. But I wanted to do more. I wanted to prove that this team was consistent. I kept battling with this same team and stayed near the top of the ladder for over 2 weeks, almost entirely maintaining at least a top 10 ranking. And in that time, I actually made one small but impactful change to the team. I switched Focus Blast on Deoxys for Superpower. This was a huge improvement. Not only did it get rid of the accuracy problems and still one-hit KO Kingambit, but it helped in a lot of other unexpected ways. Terra Steel or Dark Claw's Iron Blissey used to be a bit of a challenge, but now they got completely destroyed. It also gave a nice way to damage Assault Vest Iron Crown when switching in, which is otherwise really difficult for Deoxys to get past. The funny thing about this team is that there's nothing about the current metagame that makes it work particularly well. I could have built this same team years ago, when Terra Blast was legal and Polteageist was still a monster. The lesson here is that assumptions in team building should be challenged more. We shouldn't consider certain Pokemon to be required staples just because everyone uses them. And I don't say this to be preachy, I made this mistake as well. I only left Polteageist off of my team because of the Terra Blast ban. If it was still legal, I probably would have kept using it. And I only ran 2 Trick Room setters with 4 super fast Pokemon because I forgot to get rid of Trick Room when I removed Slowbro. So the next time you have a crazy idea that every sane person thinks is wacky or terrible, maybe give it a try anyway. It probably will suck, but if it doesn't, it may be glorious. So the final team is Defensive Indeedee, Nasty Plot Life Orb Deoxys Speed, Weakness Policy Arm Rouge, Eject Button Defensive Hatterene, Choice Scarf Cinderace, and Terra Electric Hawlucha. If you want to try this team for yourself, it's linked in the description. But be warned, unlike most Hyper Offense builds, this is not an easy team to play. Now, when most people say this team is hard to play, they mean this team is bad and you have to get a ton of predictions correct to win. That's not what I mean. This team is quite forgiving of wrong predictions and bad turns. By difficult to play, I mean that there are a lot of moving parts. Timing Psychic Terrain turns, Trick Room, and the many one-time use items make this team a bit of a puzzle to use. To get the best results, you really have to be paying attention. It's not the kind of team to play while you're watching Netflix. Also, a quick message to the haters. You'll notice that this team doesn't have Alomomola. One quick disclaimer before we end the video, I wanted to acknowledge that there is another team that used Psychic Terrain and hit rank 1, performing very consistently. It doesn't rely on Psychic Terrain as heavily as this team, and more so uses it as a way to avoid priority on more conventional Trick Room abusers, but it does have Expanding Force on Indeedee, Hatterene, and Hoopa, and is overall a really cool team. I wasn't sure whether to consider this as a Psychic Terrain team narratively speaking, as it looked so different from traditional Psychic Terrain teams and didn't use terrain as heavily, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledged it. I'll link the RMT to that in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. Let me know if the level of detail here was good. I got just a little bit more detailed than my B-drill video and snuck in some team building lessons here and there. Did you enjoy those, or would you rather I just stick to the main story and not get so down in the weeds? Any feedback is appreciated. And if you have anything else you want to say or any questions or ideas about the team, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Thanks, and have a great day.